Well, over the last couple of weeks, we have seen that in the Bible there are two storylines. The upper story is God's story, where God fulfills his purpose, and the lower story is our human story. It's the story of the human characters with all their complexities and details of daily life. Sometimes those details look like God is acting unfairly. Doesn't seem fair for God to kick Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, for example. It doesn't seem fair for God to favor Isaac over his older half-brother Ishmael. But God's purpose is only made known to us when we see things from an upper story perspective. God calls us to capture that upper story and its effects on our lives. The story of Joseph is a great example of how the upper and lower storylines come together in the Bible. So help me out here. When you hear something happening to Joseph that you think is good, I want you to tell me by saying that's good and going thumbs up. Okay, you want to practice. That's good. Okay, and then when it's bad, you're going to go, that's bad. You can say it out loud, that's bad. Yeah, okay. So let's see how God uses the good and the bad to create his purpose in Joseph. The story starts back in Genesis 37, as we heard earlier today. It's when Joseph is sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. That's bad. Yeah, say it together. That's bad. Yeah. And Joseph is only 17 years old when this happens, but he is the favorite of his father Jacob. That's good. All right. Joseph has dreams of his brothers and his parents bowing down to him, but this does not make him popular with his brothers. So that's bad. Joseph's brothers sell him to a band of Ishmaelites, and they tell his father Jacob that Joseph has been killed by a wild beast. The Ishmaelites take Joseph as a slave into Egypt. That's all pretty bad, yeah. Joseph is so, are you keeping track of the good and the bad? I'm not either. Yeah. So, Joseph is sold as a slave to an Egyptian official named Potiphar, and he becomes Potiphar's right-hand man. That's good. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. That's probably bad, yeah. But when Joseph refuses, she falsely accuses him of assaulting her, and he ends up in prison. That's bad. While he's in prison, Joseph gets a reputation for correctly interpreting people's dreams. He's got his friend Pharaoh's baker and his friend Pharaoh's cupbearer, and they come to him with their dreams, and he tells them what's going to happen, and it does. So he begins to build a reputation as someone who's got an inside knowledge of what dreams mean. That's probably good. That's good. But he never, ever, through all of this, through becoming a slave, through becoming imprisoned, being falsely accused, through none of this does the Bible tell us that Joseph ever plays the victim card. He never complains about his position. He stays connected to God through the whole thing. And the Bible tells us several times throughout this story, the Lord was with Joseph. That's good. So now we come to the point where Pharaoh starts having some pretty troubling dreams of his own. And none of his wise men or his magicians can interpret them for him. What do you think? That's bad. Okay. But remember that Joseph built his reputation in prison for being a good interpreter of dreams through the very people that are now serving Pharaoh. So this could be, what do you think? Could be good. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and Joseph goes in, and hears Pharaoh's dream, and he correctly interprets it. And he counsels Pharaoh to prepare for what these dreams tell them about the future. Think that's good? Okay, that's good. So in dream number 1, Egypt is going to have 7 years of bountiful harvest. I bet it looked a lot like what this year's harvest is looking like for us right now, wouldn't you think? So they get 7 years of this. That's good. That's good. But in dream number 2, those 7 years of bounty are going to be followed by 7 years of famine. That's bad. But Joseph shares with Pharaoh a possible way that these two dreams connected together can provide them with what they need to survive the famine. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of carrying out this plan to prepare for the years of lean times. And this puts Joseph exactly where he needs to be in God's upper story of redemption. See, Joseph is promoted to deputy Pharaoh in Egypt. He's now 30 years old, 17 to 30. It's taken him a while to get to this spot. But now he is at Pharaoh's right hand. He is in exactly the right place to do what God has put him here to do. That's good. The famine hits Canaan, where Jacob and his other sons still live. What do you think? Is that good or bad? That's bad, okay. Because we don't want anybody to starve, right? So Joseph's brothers travel to Egypt looking for food. And here's where they do bow down to Joseph. What do you think? Is this good or bad? His brothers come asking for food, and they bow down to him. What do you think? Dunno? I see some goods. I see my I don't knows, and I see some, I'm not going to tell what I think. Now Joseph is 39 years old. It has taken 9 years from the point where he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man to the point where he can finally help his own family. 17 to 30 to 39. It's 22 years since he shared his initial dreams to the time when they are fulfilled. I wonder if any of us would be waiting 22 years for God to fulfill his purpose in us. Well, here's the moment we've been waiting for in Joe's story. Now he can take revenge on his brothers for selling him into slavery. Now he can balance the scales and tie up all the subplots before the credits start to roll at the end of the movie. It's only fair. The only question left is, how is he going to do it? How will Joseph pay back his brothers for 22 years of suffering that they have caused him? Will this turn out to be good or bad? Hear the word of the Lord as it's given to us in the 45th chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 11, and then verses 25 through 28. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, and they told him, 'Joseph is still alive. He is even ruler over all the land of Egypt.' He was stunned. He could not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Israel said, 'Enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Joseph does not take revenge. Instead, he offers forgiveness and reconciliation. And if you're like me, you have to wonder why. Why on earth would he do that? Here he had them right where he needed them to get even with all they'd done to him. And yet he weeps. And he calls them to himself. And he forgives them. Joseph was able to forgive his brothers because he saw that God was up to something. He had captured that upper story, God's bigger plan. What the brothers did was certainly wrong, but God used their sin and their jealousy to accomplish his overall purpose, his upper story. God was already at work in this new nation so that God could reveal himself to the world through this new nation. God made provision through Joseph to sustain this new tribe during severe famine. The famine would have killed the little fledgling nation of Israel, but God made provision to save them by putting Joseph in the right place at the right time. Now you might wonder, why didn't God just thwart the famine? Why didn't he limit it so that Canaan wasn't affected? But God's story is bigger than our story. He knew that the nation of Israel wasn't ready. He knew that these brothers were not solidified as a tribe enough yet to take over the land of Canaan. And there's another reason that I'll tell you about in just a moment. Even though his brothers intended to do Joseph harm, God had different plans. God's plan was to preserve his people and to help them flourish. Joseph was God's agent to save the new nation by bringing it to Egypt. Why Egypt? Well, this is that other thing I was going to tell you about. See, in Egypt, shepherding was the worst possible occupation you could have. And Israel's sons were shepherds. So they considered this an abomination. The Egyptians didn't want to have anything to do with people who took care of sheep. So Jacob and his sons were given the land of Goshen, far away from the emperor, far away from Pharaoh, off in a place where they wouldn't bother anyone else. But it was the most fertile land in the whole country. This was a place where they could thrive. The other reason that they couldn't stay in Canaan and that they weren't ready yet to take that over is because God wanted to let this tribe remain pure. Intermarriage was a real threat if they stayed in Canaan. They were too much like the other people around them. But in Egypt, there was no risk of intermarrying with the Egyptians because they were shepherds, and the Egyptians didn't want to have anything to do with them. So within Egypt, the Israelites grew into a great nation, more than 1 million people in a short amount of time. Joseph was 110 years old when he died. He had had 22 years of a difficult life, but he had 71 years of a life of blessing. He saw the upper story, and it made his life in the lower story richer. It made all the junk that had happened to him something he could survive as he lived out his life. So, how does Joseph's story help us to understand our own stories a little bit better? Well, in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, he writes, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purposes." The trials that we go through test us, and they cause us to trust in God and to see his power in what we might think are desperate situations. He equips us for the very thing he wants us to do that we aren't yet ready or equipped to do, so that others will not see us, but they will see God. When we do things in our lower story to hurt other people, to hurt ourselves, there are huge consequences that we have to face for those sins. But even then, God can use our sinfulness to accomplish his overall will. So if your life isn't turning out right now the way you had envisioned it, maybe you need the perspective of Romans 8:28. Maybe you need to know that all things do work for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. But this incredible promise of God is not applied to everyone. It is only for those who have aligned their stories to the upper story of God. This promise is for those who call Jesus Lord and mean it. So how can we respond to so great a promise? Well, the first step is to love God, and that's only possible when we admit our own sinfulness, ask God's forgiveness, and repent of our sin. The second step is to align our lives with Christ, making the commitment to follow Jesus. Being a follower of Jesus means making him our leader and the ruler over our lives. It means developing a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and nurturing that relationship through prayer, Bible study, and fellowship with God's people. This is more than simply believing that Jesus is God's Son. It's a commitment to follow Jesus and then to go where Jesus sends us into the world. When you align your life to God's purposes instead of your own, you begin to change. And instead of asking God to add his blessing to your big ideas in your lower story, you begin to turn around and adjust your entire life to focusing on what God is up to. Then the promise of Romans 8:28 becomes yours. If it's not going well for you right now, if things are not making sense in your lower story, Maybe it's time for you to abandon your will to God's will. Remind yourself daily of God's upper story while you endure all these lower story issues that face you day by day. And then instead of asking, how can a good God allow evil in the world? You can ask, God, how can you turn the evil in my life into good? Instead of asking, where is God when I really need him? You can rest assured that God is present with you in every circumstance. Then you will know that all things do work together for good for those who love God and have been called according to his purpose.